Pruning near utility conductors is an integral part of utility service. Knowing how, when, and where to prune trees near conductors increases the safety, efficiency, and cost-effectiveness of any system. Some common quick and easy line clearance methods cause problems that become more serious over time. Most of these shortcuts involve setting an arbitrary line clearance distance, then cutting the top and/or side of a tree at that distance. These techniques, topping, tipping, and roundover, cause serious tree health problems and utility service problems and can cause a greater amount of new tree growth, which then interferes with conductors. In any case, corrective action is more costly and time-consuming than clearing lines properly the first time. Proper line clearing can be done only by trained workers who understand tree pruning techniques, line clearance requirements, and applicable safety standards. Both the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the American National Standards Institute issue detailed requirements to help keep workers safe during line clearance operations. Knowing and following these requirements is required. Always give your full attention to the job at hand and the hazards around you. Be constantly aware of the danger of electric shock. Never make contact with an energized conductor, either with your body or through conductive tools, branches, or equipment. Treat all conductors as though they are energized. Qualified line clearance tree trimmers and trainees must maintain minimum working distances from energized conductors depending on the nominal voltage of the conductor and elevation of the terrain. These distances are charted in ANSI Z133.1. If you are not a qualified line clearance tree trimmer or trainee, you must be at least 10 feet away and further with higher voltages. Before entering a tree, check for electrical hazards and inspect the tree for structural problems. These structural problems include items such as branch attachments with included bark, hollow trunks or branches, equal-sized or codominant stems, equal-sized trunk and branch, crotches with included bark, weakly attached water sprouts, fungi on the trunk or branches, broken or cracked limbs, and hangers. The tree's root collar should be checked for signs of root rot or decay, which would make the tree unstable. In any of these cases, plan ways to avoid or reduce these hazards before climbing. Choose the proper tools and equipment and check them before going into a tree. Hook and blade pruning tools should be used instead of anvil-type tools. Use all tools according to manufacturer's recommendations and industry safety standards. Do not push power tools beyond their limits. Pruning tools should be kept sharp. Then, final cuts will have a smooth surface and the surrounding bark will remain firmly attached. Cuts should be made to minimize the damage to the bark and cambium. Remove limbs with care, using ropes for controlled lowering of larger limbs. On thin-barked trees, use a block to avoid rope injury. Before lowering or dropping a limb, always give a verbal warning such as "look out below" or "timber." Of course, you should always know the locations of coworkers and others in the area. To further protect yourself and the tree, lower and raise tools on a hand line, not your climbing line. Don't carry or throw tools while climbing. And don't use climbing spurs when pruning living trees, except in extreme circumstances such as emergency rescues. When climbing, check limbs before putting weight on them, and avoid dead branches. Whenever possible, keep your hands and feet on separate limbs, maintaining 3 points of contact with the tree. Always try to climb on the side of the tree that is away from electrical conductors, and tie into the tree so, if you should fall, you will swing away from any electrical conductors. Clear thinking and good planning are the keys not only to safe line clearing, but to proper pruning. Many tree shapes are possible when you start pruning trees early in their lives. If possible, start before trees are 15 feet high. This best-case scenario is called first-order or natural direction pruning. First-order pruning calls for the removal of entire branches that are growing toward utility lines. Pruning is done at the point where two branches meet, or where a branch meets the trunk. These intersections are called crotches or nodes. Pruning at nodes prevents the excessive sprouting, cracks, and rot, which are caused by topping and other types of internodal pruning. Before pruning, you should know the growth characteristics of the tree. When pruning, remove entire branches that are growing toward the lines. Also, remove branches that, if cut, would produce sprouts that would grow toward the lines. Don't remove the terminal buds on branches that are growing away from the lines. If your pruning cut will remove more than half the foliage on a branch, remove it to its parent stem, but never round over, shape, or buzz the tips of branches. Always make cuts at nodes. There are times and situations when guidelines cannot be followed. When removing a branch or tree that could fall on lines, or when cleaning up after a major storm, for example. In these situations, many incorrectly pruned trees may still be helped by removing entire branches that have sprouts growing toward lines. When trees are stressed by improper pruning, many sprouts can grow from dormant buds. This may require removal of large tree sections, removal of parts of the trunk, or removal of the entire tree. Most of the previous discussion has centered on deciding which limbs to prune and where to make the final cut. However, the removal of most limbs requires more than one cut. This is especially true of large limbs. When removing large or long limbs, never cut just the tip. Remove the entire limb, but use several cuts to avoid excessive wounding of the tree. Usually, 3 cuts are needed. First, undercut the branch halfway at about 1 foot from the trunk. Be alert to avoid kickback from the chainsaw. Next, bring the second cut down just in front of or behind the first, severing the end of the limb. On the final cut, remove the stub at the branch collar. The collar is a mass of trunk tissue that forms around the base of a branch, between branch and the main stem or a parent lateral branch. The branch collar becomes more pronounced as branch vigor decreases. At the top of the collar is the branch bark ridge, which marks where the branch and trunk tissues meet. When removing a live branch, make the final cut just outside the branch bark ridge and collar. Do not cut into the collar or surrounding bark. Injury to the collar removes a major defense system of the tree and leads to excessive sprouting. However, cutting too far out and leaving a stub opens the way for rot-causing fungi. The exception is a dead branch with a collar of live wood. In this case, make the final cut just past the outer edge of the collar. There is no one set angle for a correct cut. The angle is determined by the size and shape of the branch collar. For instance, a codominant or forked stem with included bark may require an upstroke for the final cut. Again, be alert to avoid kickback, and be careful not to cut into the collar, remaining bark, or the remaining fork. Remember, the tree's defense system consists of a chemical protection boundary within the collar. A good collar cut doesn't remove that boundary. When branches are pruned correctly, rings or donuts of living tissue form around the cuts after 1 year. Since this process is efficient, wound dressings and tree paints are not needed in normal situations. Such treatments should only be used to treat disease, borer, or mistletoe, or for sprout control or special cosmetic reasons. Even though tree wounds close, pruning still causes trauma and risk to the tree. Whenever clearing lines, use as few cuts as possible to achieve the proper clearance. The 90-3-90 guideline says that in 90% of pruning situations, removing 3 branches will provide 90% of the required clearance. Still, many cuts might be required to prune a tree correctly and provide the needed line clearance. The key is to come up with a sound plan and carry it through. Then continue pruning at regular intervals. In rural or remote areas, mechanical pruning may be appropriate. Still, cuts should be made close to the main stem, outside of the branch bark ridge and branch collar. As always, use as few cuts as possible. Avoid stripping or tearing of the bark and excessive wounding, and remove all severed limbs from the tree. Of course, when trying to restore utility service in emergency situations, it may be necessary to deviate from these guidelines. However, corrective pruning should be done as soon as possible.
When you are pruning for utility line clearance, you need to know the guidelines presented in this program. Follow pruning cycles. Cut as few branches as possible. Cut entire branches. Cut branches at nodes. Cut close to the branch collar. Don't cut into the collar or the remaining bark. Remove dead branches. Don't paint cuts, and always follow safety rules.
These are not absolute rules, but guidelines based on known tree responses to various pruning techniques. As such, they do not take precedence over safe work practices. The aim of these guidelines is to reduce sprouting, reduce working time, increase the time between pruning cycles, and to help trees near utility lines to be as healthy, safe, and attractive as possible. Line clearing is a vital part of utility service. By using the proper techniques, line clearing workers, utilities, and our trees can all benefit.